When it comes to open world games, getting items is boring. And this is a bummer because it should be one of the most rewarding parts of a game, as, you know, items are the actual reward for doing things. However, obtaining new stuff is often only exciting in the early parts of open world games. Receiving those first few weapons or pieces of armor can make a character feel far stronger, and because players will be low on supplies, every little bit helps. Over time, as acquiring items becomes more common and players create a nice little stockpile of resources, the excitement that comes from getting items fades away. There are a handful of reasons as to why getting items in so many open world games isn't as fulfilling as it could be, and the easiest place to start is with presentation. When I think about games where getting an item causes me to feel excited, the ones that have some sort of fanfare stick out the most. Opening a chest in Zelda and hearing hardwires the player's brain to think, I just got something cool. And even when it isn't something that cool, the mental association tricks our dumb brains into thinking it is. It feels like an achievement, it feels important. On the other side of things, this is what getting an item in most open world games feels like. It's efficient, yes, but it isn't exciting. Now obviously a fanfare like the one in Zelda would not really work in an open world game, as there are so many more chests to open and items to get, so having it stop players to watch the same animation over and over would get tiresome quickly. But there is a huge gap between and. So finding a middle ground could help make these moments feel a little more important. I know this sounds like a surface level complaint, but being reinforced with visual or auditory flourishes can make a positive connection between the player and whatever caused those things to happen, turning something that would otherwise seem flat into a much more exciting and engaging experience. Aside from how items are presented to the player for the first time, I also think it's important for games to present items in an interesting way when they're actually in the player's inventory. I find myself feeling far more engaged with an item when it seems to take up physical space inside my inventory. Games in series like Diablo, The Witcher, and Resident Evil do a pretty good job of this. Being able to see items as physical objects in a set space makes them a little more tangible than just having them be a name written on a long list. What I like even more is when these types of grid systems have a limited amount of space, pushing players to find the optimal way to organize it. Admittedly, this is something I hate doing in real life, but playing inventory Tetris in games is something I find a surprising amount of joy in. Players have to pay attention to what's getting put into their inventory and decide what is important versus what can be tossed. Resident Evil 4 takes it one step further by having equipped items take up space in the inventory instead of there just being a designated spot for a weapon, making it so players have to decide how much they really care about the massive weapon that takes up the majority of their space. The answer's a lot. For me, this made any new weapon that I decided to keep feel more special because it came at the cost of other things. And this ties into my next point. For items to feel important, games need to make encumbrance systems that actually work. Honestly, encumbrance systems in most open world games, especially ones made by Bethesda, are pointless. The starting limit of what players can carry is typically super high, and when it is reached, there isn't a real consequence. Sure, movement is slowed to a crawl and the ability to fast travel is taken away, but players still have the option to drop items to get just below the threshold, fast travel to a town, sell their stuff, fast travel back, pick up whatever they missed, and fast travel back to the town again. It ends up taking 5 minutes, and no interesting consequences are given for being nearly over encumbered. And as soon as I mentioned fast travel, I could already hear some people saying, well, don't use it then. But it isn't that simple. Fast travel is a band-aid for bigger issues in a game, like stale movement mechanics or boring world design. It doesn't fix the problems, it just covers them up. So even if the player decides not to fast travel, they most likely will have a long, tedious walk, and it will really only make the player lose some of their time. In my opinion, unless time is a key mechanic in a game, losing it is not a good consequence. It's just padding. I think traveling and transporting items in open world games would be far more interesting if fast travel was only usable in specific locations, like the signposts in The Witcher 3 or the carriages in Skyrim, and if encumbrance systems had more gradual status effects. A solid example of this is from a relatively unknown RPG called Dark Souls. Depending on how much the player character is wearing, their overall speed and the types of rolls they can do change. This drastically affects how they handle in combat. I'd like to see something similar to this be implemented in more open world games, but instead of consequences just being dictated by what the player has on, ideally they would be affected by everything in the player's inventory. Changing the gameplay in this way would create a risk-reward system where players can take more stuff, but it would make things like combat become more difficult. The consequences for hitting different encumbrance limits could range from from making the player's stamina recovery a bit slower to them not having their full range of motion in combat, leading to them being less effective than when they are unencumbered. There could even be some positive side effects, like if a character gets hit really hard while carrying a lot of stuff, they may be less likely to get knocked back because they're just that heavy. This would cause the player to choose between whether it's better to collect a lot of loot or have full access to a preferred playstyle, creating a connection between players and the things they carry. With all of that said, even if items are presented in interesting ways and players are constantly asked to make decisions about if something is worth it or not, a huge problem with items in open world games is that most of the things players pick up are boring in and of themselves. For instance, I've noticed a trend where games will have items with the sole purpose of being sold. While I can appreciate developers wanting to add flavor and a level of realism to a game by having things other than just coins being chests, it ends up being a detail most people ignore, and it adds an extra step to getting that money. Items like this work well when there is some sort of strategic value to holding them. For example, in a game like Hollow Knight, where dying puts players at risk of losing all of their coins, items that can be turned in for cash are useful things to hold on to, and they force the player to consider when it would be best to sell them. This heavily relies on Hollow Knight's death mechanic, which I can't imagine many open world games adopting. Although I do think having players lose something upon death that they could go back and get would be a really neat mechanic for open world games to have. It would not only give more value to the materials you don't lose on death, but it would also add a new layer of tension as you head back to get your stuff, making traversal across the world more interesting. An easier approach for developers would be just adding better ways for players to lose their cash while they're out traveling. Maybe NPCs could be able to pickpocket the player's coins, or there could be more scenarios where paying a fee is actually more viable than just killing everyone in the way. However, this really only fixes a small part of the problem. The more effective solution would be giving each item multiple in-game purposes. The game that handles getting mundane loot better than any other I've played is Dungeons & Dragons. If a player finds an old wooden pipe with strange runes engraved on the side in almost any video game, they'll probably sell it instantly. But in D&D, players hold on to items like this because they can interact with them in meaningful ways. For instance, the player could use the pipe to fit in with a group of snooty nobles who could prove to be valuable allies later on. Or they could develop a smoking habit that might give them temporary relief but have consequences in the long run. Or they could hold on to it as a keepsake to show how far they've come since the start of their adventure. Due to it being a tabletop game, the only real limitation in D&D is imagination, so it's way easier to implement this sort of thing than it would be in a video game. However, I think a lot of video games would benefit from incorporating a simplified version of it. There doesn't need to be infinite possibilities, but having even just 2 or 3 uses for any given item a player can find would give a greater importance to every little thing in the world. So if they find a rabbit's foot, there could be a function where they can rub it and every once in a while it will give them some sort of luck bonus. Also, maybe if a superstitious person sees them with it, they may be more inclined to like the player character. This may be the sort of thing that doesn't interest a lot of people, but it would get me to actually pay attention to the more mundane items I pick up. As for more substantial items like weapons or armor, more often than not, players are just looking at the numbers to see if they are higher than whatever they have equipped. It definitely feels good seeing those stats go up, but oftentimes they don't really change up gameplay that much. So players are really just met with a barrage of weapons with slightly higher chances to crit or do damage. I think a lot of games would benefit from having less of the same types of weapons. I like Bloodborne's approach. They focused on creating a handful of super interesting types of weapons that improve through upgrades instead of finding more powerful versions of them. I understand the philosophy behind the gameplay loop of grinding and then getting a stronger weapon, but it is more interesting to be rewarded with something that changes gameplay opposed to something that just makes you hit a little harder. Whether this is done through visible status effects or just how the weapon handles, it creates a more memorable and noticeable change. I find that stat upgrades are too gradual and hard to notice to really be effective. However, having a new weapon open up an entirely different way to play the game is the sort of change that sticks with me. Admittedly, pretty much any aspect about a game will lose its luster after enough playtime, but I do think these ideas would help extend the amount of time it takes to get there. When the major mechanics and systems of a game do not interact with each other in interesting ways, it often leads to them not being very effective. So everything from travel to encumbrance to combat to money to health should be connected to each other in various ways. Clearly, open world games and I don't get along, and that mostly stems from the fact that on paper they should be my favorite type of game, but in practice they bug me more often than not. These suggestions are almost certainly not for everyone, and it's mostly an effort to lay out what an open world game that is perfect for me would look like. And that's a game that gives importance to the various elements that comprise it, that makes everything from a stone with a smiley face carved on it that the player finds in the ground to a giant sword that only a true hero can wield feel special. Thank you for watching. Due to the response to the last video, the next project I'm working on is a look at how I would rewrite Book 2 of Korra if I had the chance to, so expect that sometime early next month. Anyway, if you'd like to further support the channel, consider contributing to my Patreon. The biggest thing that gets in the way of me making videos more often is having to work, so the more support I get there, the more time I'll be able to spend making videos instead of doing other things. I hope you all have a great day, or night, and I'll see you in the next one.